This podcast talks candidly and openly about issues of male sexual violence. A full list of topics can be found in the episode description.
Hello and welcome back to Beyond the Silence, the official podcast of We Are Survivors. Whether you're watching or listening to us today, thank you very much for joining us. We have a fantastic conversation ahead for you, where I will be speaking to Dr. Siobhan Weir of Lancaster University and also my beloved colleague Rory about conversations involving research ethics when working with male survivors, and also more general conversations around male survivorship in a wider criminal and social context. Now, this episode will have a very different format to what you may be used to. Usually we have a lot of timestamps where you can jump between several sections. This is really going to be an in-depth focus primarily on research. We'll start with an initial conversation about research ethics, about lessons learned when interviewing male survivors and lessons for institutions. Then we're going to focus on Dr. Siobhan Weir's work about forced to penetrate rape cases involving female perpetrators and male survivors. And then finally, we will have some closing thoughts. Now, of course, remember, if you want to get involved with the show, the best way to do so is via the hashtag #WeAreSurvivors or the hashtag #BreakTheSilence. And you can find us on all forms of social media at @ThisIsSurvivors. But without further ado, grab a brew, sit somewhere comfortable, and we'll get started. So without further ado, let me please introduce my guests for the afternoon. Firstly, I have Dr. Siobhan Weir from the University of Lancaster. Siobhan, your work has focused particularly on the cases of forced to penetrate. I'll use the term sexual assault, that will come relevant later. Sexual assaults via forced to penetrate cases, examining men who have experienced sexual violence perpetrated by women primarily. Your work is also pulled in a direction more recently, talking about the ethics of general survivor research and also exploring the rape myths that surround men and helping to keep them in silence. And I also have my beloved colleague Rory here. Rory is our information and policy coordinator. Rory, you've had a long journey with the organisation. Primarily, you initially worked in an administrative role, but also with our expert reference group, which is a sort of a panel of survivors that acts like a kind of moral compass for the organisation. And so you know firsthand, both through your own research and work with Siobhan, but also with those men there, the importance of bringing survivors' voices into any conversation. So thank you both for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to open our conversation up first, more sort of generally looking at research and the sort of ethics behind it, but more specifically, how can research benefit male survivors?
I think that's a really good and important question. I think the benefits come in so many ways. So thinking about it from the perspective of male survivors being able to be involved in research and having an opportunity to share their story, have their voice heard, contribute to a body of work that raises awareness and understanding of particular aspects of male survivorship. But also I think more generally research can be really helpful for male survivors, not as participants, but as men who can access that research, especially it should be open access, it should be accessible.
Right, yeah.
So that they can then learn more and maybe feel less isolated as well.
Feel like they can identify with other people, that organisations are seeing things that are going on at a larger scale.
Yeah.
So it can target silence in a lot of different ways. Mm-hmm. What are some of the ethical considerations when it comes into play of interviewing survivors?
I think one thing to consider throughout the entire process of engaging with survivors in research or survivors as participants or even survivors as researchers themselves is that kind of concept and material implications of breaking silence. So in any sort of kind of broad ethical approach, we need to consider that these words, these testimonials, these accounts themselves should be taken as seriously as the disclosure itself. That breaking of silence that is so intrinsic to our organization itself. So materially, it's about ensuring that when we, for example, bring clients in to be part of workshops or interviews, that our trauma-informed staff are part of this process. They're there to talk and to debrief, or even just to have a chat about kind of what the research represents. But likewise, when it comes to survivors who, of course, as many do, greatly enjoy and feel fulfilled and incorporate into their healing journey that participation in research, that we understand this is not just data, it's not just words that's going to go into a paper. It's part of their journey, as I say. It's part of their movement to break the silence and to be part of awareness raising.
So it's a vehicle for disclosure, but one that doesn't have to be sort of re-traumatizing for someone, that gives them a chance to express their opinion and be heard in a wider context. Something I find really, really interesting throughout your work in particular, Siobhan, is your 2019 project report is a great example of this with Dr. Joanne Hulley. But that focuses on the experiences of men who've been forced to penetrate, which I'll talk more about that particular topic area in greater detail later. But safe to say that throughout that particular piece of research, you're using often full quotes from survivors, direct quotes about either their specific instances of survivorship or their impact. You even at one point include a conversation between one of the interviewers and one of the participants where they talk about why they couldn't, express this to their GP. So there's a lot of full conversations in there. What is so crucial and important about including survivors' words within research rather than just data and figures?
For me, it's about centering survivors' voices, but it's also making sure that they are captured accurately. So it's not for me to interpret anyone's story. It's not for me to suggest it means one thing when they may have said another.
Yeah.
So it's an authentic and accurate capturing, I think, of those voices. But also, I think, particularly in the context of male survivors and kind of more broadly male sexual victimization,
Yeah.
I think it's easier for society to be dismissive of those experiences, to use kind of gender stereotypes, sex role stereotypes to minimize the seriousness, the harms, all of those sorts of things. And I don't think that numbers and data capture any of that.
Don't tell the full story.
And actually, sometimes, numbers and data can be used to suggest that it's not a problem, that it's not an issue.
Oh, for
Especially
minimization.
for minimization. If we suggest that, so, the data tells us that more women experience sexual violence. So it's easy then to say, well, it happens to less men, so it's not an issue.
Right.
But that's not how we should be using data.
Yeah.
So I think data has value. I just think that the voices of men have more value and they are more powerful in explaining the impacts that sexual violence of every type has for men. But also, there is nothing more powerful than hearing from a man himself about his experience.
Yeah, and is this something you find yourself agreeing with Rory about, potentially even the story told by the specific words that survivors might use to describe an experience?
Wholeheartedly. One thing I'd like to acknowledge, I think, from what Siobhan's just mentioned in terms of the situation of women's representation, for example, in the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, which is published by the Home Office in 2021, we're in a political animus right now where women's voices are represented verbatim in a lot of policy in around tackling rape and sexual assault.
Yeah.
And men fall under it by default, essentially.
So the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, that also includes provisions for men.
It does. So we're at this point where there is mentioning of male survivors within the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy 2021. But it's expressed as having centered women and girls. There is a supplementary position statement published in 2022, which is a very long title, that's why I had to take notes. It's a supporting statement of male victims of crimes considered, etc., where there is an acknowledgement of male-specific survivorship and victimhood.
Yeah.
But we're in a position now where it's really important, I think, that what Siobhan has stated kind of gets carried through in how we take research and how we ethically consider research and where it goes beyond just the activity and to where we can use it to influence and awareness raise, because male testimonies and speech and words can be something that's useful on the part of informing policy as much as data is important. So considering Benabesi Yekti, who's an MP in the House of Commons, he brought forward a 10-minute motion on a proposal for an intimate violence against men and boys national strategy. We're now seeing policy being developed on the part of representing men and boys in informing legislation around survivorship and how that has implications for service provisions in the police. It's really important, again, that we have data and verbal testimony from men and boys with regards to consultation and raising awareness in general to create the proper legislation so that we can, leave no male survivor behind.
Is there a sense that we are, I say we, I'm a very clearly Australian man, but I'll speak as a British person for a moment here. Is there a sense that we as a nation are behind other countries and in terms of bringing in these conversations involving male survivors? I'm thinking for a moment about organisations that remind me a little bit of our own ERG on a wider scale, that expert reference group, such as the German Survivors Council. And there's a large impact you can see immediately from direct conversations having a sort of a direct body that if any legislation involving survivorship comes up, that you've got a multi-gender group that can immediately inform on those decisions. Do you find the UK is maybe behind the curve on these conversations on male survivorship?
I think particularly in relation to legislation,
Sure.
And elements of policy. So, Rory mentioned the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy,
Yeah.
which I'm massively in support of.
Of course.
I think it's massively problematic, though, that for men and boys and for women and girls, that they're included within that. So I think there's something, I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because the groups that are working in this space are, yourselves and others who are supporting men and boys are doing an incredible job of advocating for men and boys. But there's still more groups, there's still more advocacy happening in relation to women and girls. And I think sometimes the conversation can get quite us versus them.
Yeah, tribalised.
Exactly that. And that's not, I know that's certainly not your position, and it's certainly not my position. There's more than enough space, there's more than enough resource, there's more than enough opportunity for us to recognise that everybody, no matter your gender, your sexuality, geographically where you live, your background, can be affected by sexual violence. We don't need to kind of become tribal in order to progress, but I think it can sometimes feel that way. And I think that is what raises the importance of this separate strategy for men and boys around kind of that interpersonal violence that they experience, to recognise that it's actually different. There are similarities, but they're experiencing it as men. And there are very particular barriers, very particular myths and stereotypes that men experience that are different to what women experience. And women have different, for example, structural inequalities that affect them. And that may be particular barriers when they experience sexual violence.
Yeah.
So trying to put it all in together, which is what's happening in policy at the moment, doesn't feel like it's working the way it's meant to.
One size fits all often doesn't fit anybody at all. Yeah. And just in terms of that kind of conversation there about how survivorship is experienced, can you give me an idea about maybe in relation to myths or I don't want to say outcome, I'll say the impact that survivorship can have on a man or a woman? Are there areas where you find a lot of similarity? Are there areas where you find a lot of difference?
So I think for men, I think it depends on the form of sexual violence they've experienced, because there's very specific myths that pertain to men who've, for example, been raped by another man.
Yes.
And a lot of those myths pertain to issues around sexuality.
Yeah.
And we know that there's, a perpetrator of male rape is not necessarily a homosexual man, and that a victim is not. But those are really pervasive.
These are the most prevalent ones in conversations.
Hugely pervasive. For men who experience sexual violence perpetrated by women, though, it's different. And so we see a lot of myths and stereotypes. Number one, the main one being it can't or doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And a lot of those, that's underpinned by this idea that physicality. So men are physically stronger, so they'd be able to fight a woman off, for example.
Right, yes.
But that assumes that there is physical force involved.
That's the kind of assumption that harms both men and women.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. And the law has no requirement in relation to any form of sexual violence that physical force is used. But also around, I guess, an expectation, particularly for heterosexual men, that they welcome all sexual encounters with all women all of the time, so that a man would never say no to a woman who's initiating sex with him, that consent is always given, and that if they become sexually aroused, that denotes consent and all of that sort of thing. So this
can play into the lucky boy syndrome that you've picked up on your own work. This is from Struckman and Johnson in 1998, and it talks about this idea that, well, you had sex, lucky you. And often younger men during their sexual development, if they experience unwanted sexual contact with a woman who's much older than them, the way that's culturally seen, but also internally seen. I've seen it play out in rooms before where survivors who have been in a unique position of having experienced abuse perpetrated by a man will then casually and gone through huge periods of silence about disclosure around that, will, after having disclosed their experiences perpetrated by another man, they will very casually brush over equally red flag raising and concern raising experiences that they've had with women.
Yeah.
And just sort of wave it away as saying, well, that was my sexuality, or, well, yes, I was 14 and they were 38, but
Yeah.
And so the way that can play out in a room is very, very interesting also.
And it can prevent men from recognising that what they've experienced is not acceptable, is not appropriate. And so they don't recognise those experiences.
And then they can be hand-waving the impact it can have on them.
Sure.
Yeah, certainly. Now, is there a concern that the sort of language we might be using as professionals or as researchers could actually alienate men from engaging within research?
Kind of the most notable example I think I've seen, not just within liaising with researchers, but also just with being a part of the survivor community itself, is around kind of that victimhood survivorship distinction. That is something which, in research as much as in policy as well, can either be taken not so seriously and seems interchangeable, or be presented as a hard binary, which is actually quite unpragmatic at times. So, kind of there's this initial assumption that if you're a victim, there may be this kind of ongoing kind of re-traumatization and re-experience of hurt that might be kind of incorporated into that definition, where survivorship is this idea that you put it in the past tense. Kind of there's a lot of different explanations and considerations for how you phrase that, but it's one which needs to be at the very least acknowledged. I can't really provide much of a sincere or even objective answer as to which term you would use. I mean, in a sense, it almost becomes quite philosophical, I think, which one you choose to or which you don't choose to.
Yeah.
At least within our services here, we acknowledge how a survivor or a victim would like to identify under whichever particular term, but it is something we're conscious of, especially in kind of developing research policy around how a survivor, well, essentially shows up. How do they wish to express or disclose the nature of what they're bringing forward?
Yeah, no, and I've met survivors who've talked to me in the past, and they've said, well, I often feel like a survivor, but today I feel like a victim. So it can be sort of where it sits with them. I suppose that can play into wider conversations about how we imagine what a victim looks like, and also how we imagine what a perpetrator looks like. There could be a sort of a masculine attachment to the word survivorship, perhaps why we use it so much ourselves. I think it's an interesting conversation about how we might end up inadvertently sort of excluding people from talking about their experiences. Is that something you've run into, where you feel like masculinity or a understanding of a desire to sort of hold back a sort of a dam inside comes out in the research room, and suddenly you find someone close down a little bit, or feel like they don't need to explore the impact of something?
So I think masculinity plays a huge role in barriers to disclosure for many men, and that was something that I think men themselves recognised. So many of the male survivors that I've had the pleasure, the honour of speaking with, are kind of aware of masculinity and the pressures that it brings.
The straitjacket is the word we hear a lot.
Yeah. And that can be in relation to attempts to disclose to maybe male friends, maybe male colleagues, and how they may be perceived, but also how they feel they should or shouldn't react to particular situations that they find themselves in.
Yes, yeah.
Whether that is, for example, in relation to repeat victimization, or whether it's in relation to how they should process what has happened.
Yeah.
A particular expectation about men not being emotional, the idea of strength that's kind of inherently, not just physical strength, but, strength of character, strength of person. And that, particularly, in relation to where it's a man who's been sexually victimized by a woman, again, that idea that, well, they should have enjoyed, that experience, because all men enjoy sex, and it's inherently part of how men are understood. So I think that speaks to a particular expectation of masculinity as well.
Yeah.
So
No, absolutely. And what you're talking about there as well is how much they might allow themselves to feel impact or attach behaviors in their life to impact. There's some research that you've referenced in the past from Byers and O'Sullivan from 1998 and that explores the comparison between men and women who've experienced rape and sexual assault, and how much they say they were negatively affected by it. And 49.2% of men said they didn't have any long-lasting negative effects, whereas only, I think, about 6.3% of women said that they had been sort of unfazed by their experiences. And there's quite an instinct within me to challenge that and say, well, have you been? You know, and where can you identify that impact?
Yeah, and I think part of that speaks to as well the fact that certainly in the work that I've done, the men have been aware of the impacts but not wanted to speak about why they felt that way. So they would go to, for example, their GP because they were having nightmares, they couldn't sleep, insomnia, depression, anxiety, but never then. So the symptoms, they understood the symptoms, but they didn't want to talk about the cause.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that's around processing the cause and that sort of thing, and that fear of, breaking their silence, wanting to disclose it's a huge thing to do.
Do you feel that your own gender has ever put you in a position when you've been interviewing men that has either made it more easy for them to talk to you, or perhaps actually put up a bit more of a wall? It's
a really good question. So we wrote a paper on this where we were reflecting on, in academic terms, we talk about methodology.
Of course.
But one of the things that we reflected upon was the fact that both Joanne and I on the Force to Penetrate research project were women. And so for many men, that wasn't problematic, even though they were talking about the experiences where it had been a woman who had, sexually abused or assaulted them.
Mm-hmm.
But they spoke about how they generally felt it was easier to talk to women.
Right.
Because women were viewed as, again, let's pull out stereotypes here, more empathetic, more understanding. Maybe it's happened to maybe they've been sexually abused, or certainly a sense that women get that, I don't know, that space more. They're in that space more, so there's more understanding there. But it was flagged a couple of times by the men that it could have been problematic for them that we were both women. And that was a really, something for us to consider.
Of course,
Joanne was recruited to be the research associate on the project because she was fantastic and outstanding.
Yeah.
She was the best person for the job. And she did an incredible job. But it's a really, real consideration to have. And I think one of the recommendations that we made as a result of that paper that we wrote was for, future research to try and give options.
Yeah.
To try and let survivors choose if would they rather be interviewed or spoken to by a male or a female, so that they have options where that's possible.
No, it's something I really appreciate. Obviously, we offer that as an option when people are engaging with us for therapy. But if we had the staff capacity, it might be even better for us to offer that as early as someone's assessment into the organisation, even though at assessment it's quite a boundaried space and we don't expect a disclosure of trauma. It could be a consideration in future, certainly. Is there anything you feel like, in terms of a more immediate response to conversations around male survivorship and helping men talk, that institutions could be doing right now to really make a difference about how easy it is for people to talk? So, example, disclosing the impact of trauma on their university studies, speaking to charities, speaking to GPs. Are there easy tricks that might have been learned from your own experiences of ethically interviewing survivors about how to help men feel free to talk about their experiences?
I think on the part of speaking about how we can assist institutions like universities and even when we have kind of large-scale government consultations regarding topics in the future around survivorship, I think this is worth us talking about the project we've been working on. Siobhan, Emma Sleeth at Leicester and Grace Carter at Coventry, we've been working on for a couple of years now, the male survivor-led research policy.
Yes.
Kind of currently hyphenating into MSLURP.
Please tell me there's a plan to workshop MSLURP. It's terrible. It sounds like a made-up soft drink.
I think the work we do is so full of acronyms, so you kind of think about something which is kind of identifying. Slide
you past. Well, you know what? Power to MSLURP. I'll certainly never forget it.
But kind of this is a project which started when I first met Siobhan in talking about kind of the implications of your Jigsaw project.
Another wonderful acronym.
Yeah.
So break down that one for me.
So the Jigsaw project, We Are Survivors were one of our partners on that project, and we were looking at the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic had on the justice journeys of all survivors of sexual violence. So right through from reporting through to
the actual
court
judicial
outcomes.
process.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Yes. So the Survivors Voices organisation kind of provides resources on how to effectively engage survivors, either as participants, as associates, or even as researchers themselves in projects. And your project was one that referred to and cited those particular materials, and we started a discussion around how to apply this specifically to male survivorship. And from there, we involved Grace Carter and Emma Sleeth. And it's from this point we eventually involved the expert reference group and talked to survivor staff members here at our organization in formatting a policy which was universalizable, not just around research, but to institutions in general on what it means to not just speak, obviously, again, to survivors, but to actively involve male survivors in the process of developing awareness-raising campaigns and influencing beyond the activity of research itself. So at this point, we've just passed it back to the Survivors Voices organization, and it's been thoroughly read through, and we're at a point now where we're ever so close to kind of sending this out.
You're playing a bit of paper tennis, are you? A few more corrections. Yeah.
It's. I mean, as an academic philosopher, it's sort of my bread and butter. So I feel completely comfortable in doing it. And I must say, actually, to Siobhan, it has been a journey. Producing this particular document.
You've done an amazing job.
It'll be worth it.
And I'm absolutely thankful to yours and all the survivors here.
I was lucky enough to participate in that one. Yeah,
It's been an absolute pleasure. I mean, I love getting all up in the abstract, in the policy and kind of the principles and morals of things. And ironically, it's sometimes my fellow academics that pull me back down to earth to say, let's talk about material implications. But I think it's important nonetheless to always go from kind of, we are an organization, a charity that has mission, vision, values, and horizons.
Yeah.
We're constantly on every level thinking about how we apply the concept of breaking the silence all the way down to what does a client see and feel and do when they come into a room. Again, that applies as much to research as it does to therapeutic practice. And it ought to and will apply, hopefully, to when universities consider projects that involve male survivors, trans survivors, non-binary survivors, as much as we also show that this is work that is, of course, again, indebted to policy and work that's already been done by our sister organizations. I think it's one which will hopefully be the beginning of quite a significant change in raising awareness and be an important kind of channel, means, and toolkit by which we can raise awareness around men and boy survivorship.
Well, fantastic. I look forward to viewing its impact and watching your baby travel out, see where it lands. Now, while we take ourselves away from that awful visual metaphor, I'd like to pull us in another direction. I want to talk more about your work that really began first in 2017 with the publishing of your fantastically titled paper, Oh, You're a Guy, How Can You Be Raped by a Woman? That Makes No Sense. And that's, once again, to sort of jump back to a point I made earlier, that's part of a direct quote from one of your participants. And that brings the conversation more, I think it was the real first step in terms of bringing a modern conversation, certainly within Britain, about survivors of what we call forced to penetrate cases, which we might abbreviate to F2P for the sake of brevity. But that is sort of a debate around, you were considering it from almost two angles, both about the sort of the judicial impact, the justice, but also, the meaning and the importance of calling a spade a spade. If these men consider their experiences perpetrated by women to be rape, should we call it rape? So under the Sexual Offences Act 2003, which defines the offence of rape, a person only commits an offence of rape if he intentionally penetrates the vagina, anus, or mouth of another person with his penis, and there is no consent or reasonable belief of consent. Now that same act, under I think Article 4, includes a provision for a separate offence of causing a person to engage in sexual activity without consent. So Crown prosecution guidance gives a little bit of clarity about what this can include. It can be someone being forced to carry out a sexual act, such as masturbation, or being forced to engage with a third party, but also where they are forced to engage in sexual activity with the offender themselves, e.g. a woman forces a man to penetrate her. Now, as far as the government considers things, there was a petition, I believe in about 2021, about trying to broaden the definition of rape. So it would sort of include these other descriptions of offences and include these situations where a man is forced by his perpetrator to penetrate a woman. But the government's response to that was very, very short and essentially said, well, listen, these two offences might be classified as different things, but they have the same maximum sentence, even if their minimum sentences are widely different. Siobhan, it's no easy thing to begin breaking down how much of a problem that is, but please take over the conversation here.
Yeah, so I'm really glad that you flagged that there is the Section 4 offence, because one of the things that I found when speaking with male survivors is many of them didn't realise that what happened to them was a crime.
Yes.
Because they know it's not a rape offence, because when you read Section 1, it's fairly straightforward to understand that it's a requirement that the offender has a penis, therefore it can only be a male.
Yep.
But that the victim can be either male or female, because obviously the penetration can happen in relation to the vagina, anus or mouth of the victim. But Section 4, the way it's written under the Sexual Offences Act, is so complicated.
Yeah.
There's two offences within that section, a penetrative and a non-penetrative offence. And so when men were going to try and understand how to frame what was happening to them, and I guess to work out whether to go to the police to report something, they, I think one of the men said, and I can't remember off the top of my head, his exact quote was basically along the lines of, well, it wasn't rape, so it wasn't a crime.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important that you flagged that actually there is an offence under the Sexual Offences Act where if this has happened to anyone who's listening, it is a crime.
Yes.
And, that is what it should be prosecuted as.
Yeah.
It's hugely problematic, though. There's a lot of discussion around the term rape. And there's a school of thought that thinks, and in some jurisdictions, so like in Canada, for example, they don't use the term rape at all. They have like degrees of sexual assault.
Okay.
Some US states have done the same thing.
So, okay. So like almost like degrees of murder.
Sure. Yeah. Exactly. So get rid of the term rape altogether. Other people say that there's a very particular understanding of that term rape, and that to label someone a rapist, for example, is perhaps the worst label that you can give someone, because it reflects the severity of what they've done.
Yeah.
And many of the men who I've spoken to identified with that label as what happened to them, that violation of their body, that violation of that non-consensual experience. They had not wanted to engage with that, but it happened. And so I think, there's a real tension there in the sense of the law says something, but we have male survivors telling us something else, or a certain, certainly some male survivors at least. I wouldn't want to speak for everyone.
No, of course.
But some male survivors telling us that they feel differently. And I think if you ask the general public what rape was, most people would say it was non-consensual sex. They wouldn't be thinking about the specifics. And most people, I think, would say that, well, technically then anybody could be raped.
Yeah.
But obviously the law frames it quite differently. So I think there's also a tension. Often when I have conversations with people about the work that I do, they're shocked when they learn that under the law, a woman cannot be the principal offender in a case of rape. They can be an accomplice, but they cannot be the principal offender. And I think there's, again, that's that tension about the common sense understanding of what many people think rape is versus what the law says it is.
Versus the actual practical implications of it, I think that's really, really interesting as well. It's a difficult position to see someone be in, because it can often be a really, really important part of any survivor's journey, especially if they've been through an act which they might have believed they were consenting to, and then context and history and time has made them realise that it wasn't possible for them to consent in the first place. Someone using the term rape to describe their experiences can be a huge watershed moment. So I think there's a real tension there between someone wanting to, I used the term call a spade earlier, but to express the real gravity that comes with the word rape and then be told under the law that it isn't. It feels like an almost unbridgeable divide at the moment. It can also play into some gendered sentencing gaps that's very difficult. I mentioned earlier that the maximum sentence in theory for both of these offences, so that's rape and then these I would say specific, but the act is very confusing, but these other instances of sexual assault that would include force to penetrate, you could receive in theory the same maximum sentence. But just pulling some research from Arnaud Philippe at the University of Bristol, we see that women are actually more likely to, compared to male sort of sentences in sentences to prison, their average sentence is about 33% smaller, and they're also twice as likely compared to men to avoid prison. So just because the maximum bound is there, if there's cultural disagreements about who can really be responsible for something, what a perpetrator actually looks like, then the actual practical implications for a survivor standing in court about how long someone is going to be sent away for could be quite different in reality.
And the starting sentence is completely different.
Yes.
So under Section 4, the starting sentence is a community order.
Which is where you work from it at all times.
Yeah.
That's your first port of call.
Yeah.
I'm a magistrate in my spare time, so when I sit down, that is the first thing I look at. So that's the first thing on the page. That's the first initial judgment of someone's experiences. So it does play in the back of your mind.
Yeah.
And to increase from the starting sentence, you need extreme amounts of justification.
Yeah. And then the starting sentence for rape is around 4 years, I think, in prison.
Yeah.
So that's a very different discourse surrounding the type of offending.
When you've interviewed survivors of these forced to penetrate cases, are there marked differences that you found in terms of the ways in which these offences are perpetrated? We'll talk a little bit more about differences in impact later, but in terms of the mechanics of an event, is there quite a division in terms of these sort of instances of survivorship there?
That's a really good question. I think there's a stereotype that the only way that a man could be forced to have sex with a woman if he was physically overpowered, maybe some sort of physical force, threats of physical force, or weapons and things were used. But that did happen. But actually, for many of the men, it was more complicated than that. So we saw FTP happening in the context most frequently of abusive relationships.
Yeah, I've seen it mostly throughout your work. It's a lot of domestic relationships that are ongoing, but also a lot of relationships that have then ended.
Yes.
And then abuses have taken place afterwards.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's just one form of abuse that men are experiencing within those relationships. Yeah. So also seeing coercive control, physical violence, psychological abuse, financial abuse. Yeah. If children are involved in the relationship as well, sometimes the children being used as kind of weapons, if you will, within that.
Sort of held hostage in a situation. Like you need to do this, or you won't see your kids.
Children. Exactly. And interestingly, many of the men talked about FTP as being the ultimate form of control. So while it is viewed as a sexual offence and as a form of sexual violence, the men were very aware as it was really about controlling them. Right. And the ultimate way in which they were kind of, being controlled within that abusive relationship.
Does that control sort of come from a place of emasculation, or is it more about an act of showing that because I can do this to you, I can do anything to you?
I think so, yeah. The sentiment generally was that it was the worst form of abuse that they experienced.
Right, yeah.
And consequently, for example, where men did choose to disclose about the domestic abuse more broadly, many of them did not disclose the sexual violence. Right. So they would disclose the physical abuse, the coercive control, the financial abuse, but it was particularly difficult.
There's another level down, there's another barrier of silence. Okay, yeah. And in terms of these FTP cases, when we're looking at the impact it can have on a survivor, is there anything more specific to an FTP, a survivor in FTP, that might make them stand out from the impacts faced more broadly by male survivors and female survivors?
I don't know if it's something that is particularly distinct, but certainly what the men reported were the things I'm sure you see with the survivors that you support all the time, regardless of who the perpetrator has been, which is anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder.
It's almost a compelling argument to not separate the offences then. If the impact experience seems to be the same as that of rape, then ultimately, if we're trying to be more victim focused, the kind of words that get thrown around a lot, then perhaps maybe that's a bit of compelling evidence there. Is it more in the case of then the societal impact then? I know that you've done some research and work quite recently about focusing on the specific rape myths that are perpetrated around F2P. How do those myths sort of differ? How do, can you give me some examples of some less common rape myths that might be more specific to F2P cases?
Yeah, absolutely. So myself and a colleague, Dr. Dominic Wilmot, who's based at Loughborough University, have developed what we've called the Force to Penetrate, or the FTP myth acceptance scale.
Yes.
So there exists, just for context, there exists already, for example, a male rape myth. There's actually a couple of male rape myth acceptance scales, and there's multiple rape myth acceptance scales that pertain to female sexual victimization.
Yeah.
But there hadn't been anything that specifically looked at FTP cases.
Yeah.
And so some of the kind of myths that we see there are around, I would, find it difficult to believe if a man told me he had been forced to have sex with a woman. The idea that it's not harmful. So a lot centering around kind of minimization of harms.
Yeah.
The idea that men kind of should get on with it, if you like.
Right.
It's not kind of problematic behaviour. And then some that speak also to, I guess, the context within which it may or may not happen as well, like myths and stereotypes. So it might be to do with alcohol being involved, physical force, coercion, the different ways in which men may experience this form of sexual violence.
Right. Yes. And a lot of the instances you have examined in your sort of project report, of course, did involve alcohol, but there's almost sort of an assumption that there needs to be some physical violence there or some alcohol involved, which of course we find is often absent in cases against women, let alone against men. So
absolutely,
it's very frustrating to see these myths be perpetrated and sort of perpetuated. In terms of these sort of myth acceptance scales, how are they best used? Are they sort of a tool for the judiciary? Are they there for the court process? Or are they there as a way, as a researcher, to kind of be aware of your own biases?
It's a really good question. So they can be used in a lot of different ways. So there's a lot of research that have used the various myth acceptance scales that exist across the board to work out the extent to which, for example, members of the public may or may not endorse these myths and stereotypes. They can also be used within criminal justice organisations or third sector services and organisations to work out the extent to which staff, police, CPS, prosecutors, all of those different groups who are involved in a survivor's journey may or may not endorse, the extent to which they may or may not endorse these myths and stereotypes. We're also using the FTP myth acceptance scale in relation to a project that we're currently running. So it's myself, again, Dr. Dominic Wilmot, and then Maddie Miller, who's our incredible, amazing RA, who's based at Lancaster with me. And we have been running mock jury trials.
Oh, perfect.
So it's all very academic in the sense we have two streams, we call them, two work packages, if you will. The first has been involving a male-on-male rape case. Again, you guys are partnering on this project with us, which we're really grateful for, and your involvement has been hugely helpful. So I guess for context, we are not able to speak to juries about how they make their decisions. It's against the law. But we know there's a huge attrition issue generally through the justice system. And there's been research that's been looking at, some really amazing research that's been done looking at how juries make decisions in cases of female rape. But there's not been anything that looks specifically at male rape within England and Wales. So we've just, the end of last year, finished our trials where it was a male rape case.
And then you've got your second stream coming up.
And we are now, this is the week in between our 2 weekends.
Oh, wow.
So last weekend and this weekend.
You're about to be very busy.
Yes, we are running our trials, our mock trials. So we've got members of the public coming to act as jurors. We have a real judge, we have real barristers, and we have an actor playing the complainant, an actor playing the defendant.
Awesome.
And then we've got some fantastic students who are being like court ushers and court clerk and stuff like that. But Yeah, so when our mock jurors come along and participate, we're very grateful for their time. One of the things we do is which wouldn't happen in a court, obviously, is they are given a questionnaire initially.
Yeah.
And within that, we're including the FTP myth acceptance scale to get a sense of, are people coming, members of the public?
What are they bringing with them?
What are they bringing with them?
Yeah,
what beliefs do they have?
with them.
Exactly. And we've used other scales as well to look at things like sexism or particular views about just having a just world beliefs and things like that.
And this questionnaire, is this your 22 questions?
Yep.
Is it the one with sort of 7 answers? So the idea being that it's it'll be a presented rape myth saying, I don't believe a man could get an erection without being sexually aroused. And then it would be sort of a scale of strongly disagree into neutral into strongly agree.
Exactly.
So this is what you're handing out beforehand.
Exactly.
Cool.
And then they complete that anonymously. They go off. They hear the trial.
Yeah.
And then they go and do their deliberations. And we are audio recording those jury deliberations. And then we can analyse the data afterwards to get a sense of. And what we found in relation to the male on male was that in the abstract, it didn't seem like they endorsed male rape myths. So perhaps it wasn't as high as we thought it might be. But actually, in the applied sense, when they actually had to talk about the case, we did see many examples.
So the language came more in. No, it's really, really interesting. I'd love to be in one of those rooms as sort of a fly on the wall. It's a really interesting experience. Obviously, I've sat in magistrates' deliberation rooms, but I have procedures whenever I hear a myth come up, and they do come up from time to time, unfortunately. I can call someone out on it and say, hey, you're trained for this position, you're trusted with a lot of responsibility. I'm also, I've got my own experience of survivorship. I can advocate for a fairer view of a defendant or a fairer view of a complainant. But there's a process where I can basically send someone on the naughty step and get them retrained or removed from the bench. Jurors don't really have that same recourse.
And we did see evidence where in some of the jury deliberations, there were other jurors who were calling out their fellow, their peers, on some of the things that were being said, which was a really positive thing to say. But that wasn't always the case.
No,
and I think it's something we should all do. But unless you are confident in that space, perhaps you've got, as you say, your own survivorship yourself.
Sure.
You work in that space. It's a lot easier than I think for everyday
than the average person, who could be at risk when they speak up about these sort of things. Yeah, you need more voices than just one voice.
100%.
No, absolutely. I think there's something interesting to kind of pull on a point you mentioned earlier about the myth acceptance scale. Obviously, when it comes to members of the public, it's clear about how measuring these things can really affect legal outcomes in juries. But also, a quote I've stolen from you, Rory, a long time ago, and that you borrowed kindly from someone else, is that responses to abuse should never resemble abuse itself. I'm misquoting that horrendously. But that idea of any organisation that works with survivorship should never replicate inadvertently or otherwise the mechanics of silence around survivorship. There's a lot there to be said about how we can look at sort of internal biases and during someone's disclosure process, be there and be aware of what they might be bringing into the room and what we might be bringing to the room, certainly.
Yeah. So on that position, on institutions not talking to survivors in a way that replicates or re-traumatizes them in the same manner as abuse may take place.
Yeah.
That is from the Survivors' Voices Charter itself that we mentioned earlier and that we've cited. It's a position that initially applies to research in that when it comes to the ladder, the survivor involvement ladder that they also put forward, it's that any sort of engagement, regardless of whether it's actually survivor led or if it's just survivor associated, it needs to be conducted in a manner in which it is not interrogative. It's not something which is tokenistic, and neither is a situation where, and to speak more generally, a survivor feels like they've been spoken for. And that's something that can take place, as we understand it, and listening to you two talk about how it takes place in the criminal justice process is something that can be done implicitly as well as explicitly. So when it comes to, for example, one kind of interesting kind of policy area where this is the case is in something that's come out in the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse in 2022. In one of their recommendations, recommendation 15, which is that a victim of child sexual abuse only has technically 3 years after the disclosed event to claim injury for the event itself. And that's something which is now being, enacted on. And it's one of these situations where, of course, you're going to feel like you are not being taken seriously as somebody that feels and ought to signify that I am a survivor, let alone somebody who deserves justice and a better life after this event if you quantify it by way of 3 years. So that's again a worst case situation, but one which is responded to in a manner in which we need to consider, for example, with male survivors in general, it takes years and years and years, decades to disclose abuse. So any situation where we are in knowledge exchange with male survivors needs to be one which is, temporal. It acknowledges the time it takes, whether it be on the grand scale of how long it took to disclose.
Yeah.
Next to how long does it take sitting in a room in an interview space to actually kind of move to making a point, as I often struggle with.
So you're not rushing survivors. You're giving them the space to feel safe enough to open up.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But it's one which is interestingly, and this is something which I think we faced in kind of formalizing and bringing your experience and working in research into kind of a formal process. It's one which has to be, it's tricky. It has to be a policy. It has to be a process. It needs to be a metric. And there's ways that we have talked about measuring and making metrics, whether it be to do with survivor involvement or to do with myths, about making formalized processes around what it means to be a survivor in particular situations. But at the same time, it needs to be one that places the subjective instead of the objective at the very center. How does one show up? Yeah, really, it's a really tricky dialectic, I think I would say, because it needs to be one. It needs the whole situation of engaging and talking with survivors in a manner where you want to raise awareness has to be one which is as pertinent to the universal problems of, policy, our mission of breaking the silence, creating good services and maintaining the services we already have, all the while the particular of who is it who's sitting in front of us.
Yeah, and who do we capture and who do we not capture is really interesting as well. I'm glad that your research, Siobhan, has in the past included submissions from online sites, social media, places like that, because there's a sense that when you are looking to speak to survivors, so many of these barriers that we see play out even in the room are going to play out before anyone even gets in the room. Like, who do we actually find? Who do we reach? I think something that would be really, really beneficial is if there was a way to create more anonymous forums for survivors to talk or speak with professionals before they have to come into a room and disclose. But that is a security nightmare because of some of the ways in which abuse is perpetrated. Mm-hmm. But that feels like something that would be, a great goal, a great place, a great project for someone to really undertake. I'd like to ask you both a few questions, pulling away from that sort of narrative of criminal justice, which we focused on. But in terms of research, in your research and others' research, what advice would you give around framing survivors' stories outside of that narrative of criminal justice, not just defining it by whether or not someone is pursuing a perpetrator or going through the legal system, but the everyday sort of lived experiences of someone?
It's one again where the move from the feeling of the intimate bodily effects that sexual assault has on somebody throughout their life, how that moves into signification, into words. We've seen in the office the great kind of artwork that survivors produce, for example, poetry, the way people come into sessions and they decide to present on a particular day. It's all those emotions again to consider kind of aspects of psychosocial theory here for a moment, thinking about kind of post-Lacanian models of like real and symbolic registers of speaking, how things move from kind of being kind of internalized and felt, but that shift then to the symbolic register of speaking about things always feels like a leap, and it's very difficult.
Yeah.
And in the symbolic register, when we talk about words, writing things down, policies, research, just us talking here now and me turning thoughts into words, it's one which is half the battle before we even start to kind of get our ducks in a row, I think. And that's where I spend far more of my time in the former before kind of bringing things to other people to put them in a row. But so long as things are presentable, to be put in a row. I think one interesting example of this, where this thought is happening, probably in far less abstract terms, is in I believe there's survivor victim statements that can be brought into into criminal justice settings.
Yes.
The importance of a survivor being given the opportunity to write out or to pre-record, for example, their experience of survivorship and subsequent trauma and how their lives have played out ever since. It's a situation like that is if brought in, if I understand it, is to be brought into kind of formal proceedings, is one which kind of helps to bridge that gap. Nothing's perfect, but it's something that does really show kind of the problem of what it means to break silence, I think, and how we can begin to kind of, again, formalize this process into one which is practical and pursuing justice.
That's something that we're beginning to explore at the moment through some projects that are going on in the background that I really want to talk about. But I will hold my stum and my tongue on for the moment about victim impact statements in particular. But I really, really like that idea of putting someone's lived experience directly in the courtroom. So you've got your legal tests, you have all of your checks and balances, you have the burden of proof, the burden of being believed. And after someone's gone through the really difficult experience of being interrogated on the stand, and they've gotten the result that they were looking for, or the right result, then there is that impact statement that is always there in the room as well. It's something that's hugely influential to the decisions I make. If it's not read out in court, I get a little, what's the word? I get a little fusty. I get very happy. So I read it out in the retiring room and make sure that that's in the space with us. But I think there's something to be said about when survivors will feel safe and how people do feel safe and what safety looks like for each survivor, about when they feel ready to sit in a research room or when they feel ready to have their voice heard online. Siobhan, just how far away are we from a society in which all survivors do feel safe to come forward?
That's a huge question. I think we're quite a long way away, without wanting to sound too negative.
No, of course. I mean, that's
I think we have to be realistic, right? I think there's lots of reasons for that. I think, we've seen this incredible feminist movement happen.
Yeah.
Which has created this space and this voice for women.
Yeah.
And I've benefited from it.
Sure.
And, I identify as a feminist.
Mm-hmm.
But there isn't the same kind of movement that's happening in relation to men. Or where we see unfortunately quite extreme versions of it. So I'm thinking more of like the men's rights, quite far.
So quite an anti-response.
Exactly.
Rather than like an equivalent Me Too movement.
Exactly.
More of a, let's push back against this narrative.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think that makes it more difficult, particularly for male survivors, because there isn't that same push of this kind of collaborative with this aim of, a particular aim. And I know that there's work happening like with yourselves, other organisations, but it is, for many men, it's a postcode lottery as to whether they can even access provision.
Yeah, of course.
Do they know where to go for support?
Mm-hmm.
I'll never forget one of the men that we interviewed said he thought it was just him that it had happened to, like specifically FTP had happened to, and he had no clue that there was other men that it happened to. And until I think that it's all forms of sexual violence experienced by men are spoken about more openly, the idea of breaking the silence, which obviously is kind of central to your mission.
Yep.
But until that happens more, and until, I guess, as a society, we become more comfortable with recognizing different forms of masculinity, we become more comfortable with recognizing that men do not need to be these strong, tough, impenetrable, have no feelings and emotions, that kind of really harmful stereotype. I think it's difficult. But also, we don't see regular representation of male survivorship in popular culture.
No.
We, when these storylines happen, we've seen it on Hollyoaks, we've seen it on Coronation Street, and I know that the team here have been involved in that in the past. They are, kind of groundbreaking, and they are really impactful. But we see representations of female survivorship, both positive and negative.
Yeah.
And some of them are very problematic.
Very
those
sensationalized.
Representations, but we see them.
Yeah.
But when you don't see, and it's that idea, you have to see it, you kind of hear about it to believe that it happens.
Yeah.
And I think if your life hasn't been touched by it, or someone that you know's life hasn't been touched by it, it becomes this invisible thing that doesn't happen. And until we get to that point where we can speak much more openly about it, and I mean, it's still hard for many women to talk about it. And I think we're much further on that journey for women than we are for men.
Yeah. No, and absolutely. And it's really difficult as well, finding yourself trying not to get pulled into the conversation or the assumption that increasing male voices is going to decrease female voices.
Yeah.
If you've got a lot of men within institutions or a lot of men within power structures, their voices are very loud. And there's plenty of survivors out there who want to be part of that fight for women as much as they want to be a part of that fight for their own recognition. The only depictions I ever saw of forced to penetrate rape when I was growing up were in comedy. And that was it. It was a punchline.
Yeah. Yep. I think to kind of bound off an absolutely profound point that I think Siobhan's just made about kind of the falsity of kind of this idea of opposition between kind of the male universe and the female universe, and talking about this. If we are going to even imagine kind of an idealistic sort of absolute end of history for the movement, it's one where as we have said multiple times, the indebtedness we have to the feminist movement in just having the motion, let alone the lexicon, I think, to talk about survivorship alone, it will be something where when we do have a world where no male survivor is left behind, it is one which will be viewed in synthesis with the feminist movement in general. I think it's something where it's a hand-in-hand motion, and it's one that's which is as individuated as much as it is a political movement, I think. And it's absolutely something which I'm very happy to be a part of and look forward to seeing the progress of. And I think the work we do and the work our organisation does.
Yeah, well, we're all rowing in the same direction. Siobhan and Rory, thank you so much for your time today. It's been absolutely wonderful speaking with both of you. Can I ask you one final question? It doesn't have to be a long answer. It can be a very short answer. And our guest from our previous episode just took one from Malcolm X. So if you had one thing you could say to any survivor or someone who knows a survivor listening to this podcast, what would it be?
I think for me, it would be that you are not alone. Even though you may feel really isolated right now, even though you may feel that it's only you that this awful thing has happened to, that you are not alone, that there are many other men that sadly it has also happened to, but that there are also people, organisations, places and spaces that are willing to listen to you in a really non-judgmental and open way. And when you are ready, you can go and find those people, because they absolutely exist. And then you will see, I guess, in a physical form, that you are not alone.
And it's something that's so exciting as part of that is that for some survivors, certainly when they come into our organisation, that first journey for them and that first journey of trust, it might be really, really crucial that they speak to another survivor or see other male survivors to feel visible. But that there will come a point during their journey and throughout their interactions with our service and the wider world, in whatever context it may be, where they speak to plenty of other non-survivors of sexual harms or of trauma in general who understand them and will listen to them. Rory, what about yourself, mate?
I think with respect to what we said before, I think simply take your time, and it takes as much energy as it requires. I think words are, the world is a machine made of words, and the most complex of machines in the world are made up solely by words. And yours as a survivor will be a part of it, and it will always have an interplay with other people's words, whether it be through artwork or just through disclosing or just speaking to somebody else. But it takes time.
I like that. And if talking about it is the hardest thing you ever do, then it's still worth it.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you again to both of you for your time. And of course, thank you to our lovely audience for listening and watching wherever you may be today. If you would like to get involved with the show, if you'd like to submit articles, submit your words, or simply topics or feedback, then the best way to do that is to send it into This is Survivors on all forms of social media, good, bad, or otherwise. You can also tweet out the hashtag #WeAreSurvivors or hashtag #BreakTheSilence. But for now, from our safe space to yours, thank you for listening.